Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Glad to have you all with us today. Hope that everyone had a safe and enjoyable holiday season and that your new year is off to a good start. We're excited to be back with you today and to have you hear from Kurt Degenfelder, who will introduce momentarily. We're going to take a moment, just allow everybody to get into the room, and then we will go ahead and get our session underway, our first session of 2022. And please forgive me, I'm off camera today. I'm recovering from the flu and dealing with a little bit of pink eye, so I don't want anyone to be concerned. I am well, and I thought I'd give you a nice smiling image of me rather than the current one. So please appreciate your forgiveness in that respect. We're just letting a few more folks are coming into the room, and we'll go ahead and get ourselves started. All right, Olivia, if you would,
All right,
please.
Ready to get started. Welcome, everyone. Hello. Just admitting a few more folks. We are very pleased to have you for today. Welcome. This is the CEO and CFO Leadership Institute. Today, we will be discussing Module 3, Managing the Bottom Line. And this is the third of 7 modules to be covered over the course of the CEO and CFO Leadership Institute. On behalf of the National Association of Community Health Centers, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event. My name is Olivia Peterson. I will be your technical host today. And I'm pleased to bring you this session along with my colleague, Gerard Jolly, who you all know, who is the Director of Career Advancement Strategies at NAC. And so before we get started today, I have just a few quick housekeeping items to review with you all. First and foremost, please note this meeting is being recorded. The session will be approximately 90 minutes, including presentations and Q&A. As I'm sure many of you know at this point, Zoom allows you to join by video or phone. So if you do run into any issues with your audio today, we definitely encourage you to try calling into the webinar. And then throughout the session, we really encourage you to share your comments and questions. The chat box is open to you, so please feel free to plug your questions into there. And then you can also feel free to raise your hand if you would like to ask a question verbally. You'll notice that your line was automatically muted when you joined the call today, and we ask that you keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking, just to avoid any interruptions or background noise. But if you would like to ask a question, please just raise your hand and we will call on you to unmute yourself. If you're looking for the slides for today, they can be found in the calendar invitation, and then the recording, I believe, will be posted to NoddlePod, and that should be available within the next week or two. And that concludes the housekeeping. So without any further delay, I am going to go ahead and turn things over to my colleague Gerard to introduce today's speaker for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Olivia. And again, let me extend a warm welcome to everyone to our session today on managing the bottom line. As you all are certainly firmly aware, despite the nonprofit status of community health centers, it's necessary to regularly turn a profit to create funds to invest in the future. And this session today is going to cover some of the basics of health center profitability by discussing efficiently performing services and moving into payer mixes, rate settings, and the revenue cycle. This session is going to discuss the financial implications of the 330 grant and other grants and contracts. We'll focus somewhat on the expense side, starting with provider staffing, productivity, and compensation, and cover other staffing ratios and staffing implications of practice transformation, ending with a focus on the bottom line and managing cash. We're excited to have with us today Kurt Degenfelder. Kurt is the president of Kurt Degenfelder Consulting. He has a great deal of experience working with community health centers. Next slide, please. I believe some of you had an opportunity to meet with Kurt out in Las Vegas during our kickoff, and others of you I understand have actually worked closely with Kurt as well at your health centers on various financial, operational, or strategic solutions. As you are likely aware, he works on FQHC payment reform and APMs. Has performed a number of trainings for health centers, PCAs, and of course for us here at NAC. And we're excited that he is investing as a board member of Westside Family Health Center in Culver City, California. So we're excited to have Kurt with us. And without further ado, we're going to turn our attention over to Kurt Degenfelder.
Thanks, Gerard, and good morning, everyone. We have quite a bit of material. We won't be ending with the bottom line, Gerard. We're always thinking about the bottom line, so I promise you that. So we have a lot of material. It's hard to cover all in 65 minutes, so I'll be going more quickly or less quickly on certain things, but I want to encourage, I can see with everyone introducing themselves that you know how to use the chat function. I would encourage all of you to type comments, questions, concerns, share your own experience in the chat. I think that really adds a lot of texture to the presentation, a lot of depth. So feel free at any time. In addition, I think it's great that we have CEOs and CFOs. We can talk a little bit about that interaction and maybe the perspective for each on certain issues. And then lastly, I will be ably assisted by Olivia, who will be changing my slides. So Olivia, next slide, please. Okay, so Gerard, I'm glad to hear you, reciting the mantra at the beginning. Yes, we are nonprofit 501c3s, but we can turn a profit. This will not lead to HRSA asking for money back or reducing the 330 grant. What HRSA is more worried about actually is health centers that are losing money and are going to, potentially not be able to deliver all of the services to the community. So no problem, from a federal perspective, making a profit. Yes, a regular profit allows us to build reserves. Now we are in a strange time, folks. Not just because we're in a pandemic, but also being a healthcare provider and being an employer right now is challenging, right? People are our biggest asset, but getting enough people, keeping them safe, having them always be able to come into work is certainly a challenge now. So we'll talk a little bit about finance during COVID at the end, and also consider that in everything we say. This is not to say that you can't ever lose money. So it's just, you can't be in a situation where you're always losing money. This is not to say you can't have a site that loses money. Maybe, expansion, growth, as you build that patient base, maybe that lowers the profit for a certain period of time, and then over time it stabilizes. So a lot of our, we talk about the CFO, and certainly the CFO has a lot to do with finance, but a lot of our money making comes out of operations, right? Not necessarily out of finance. So we're going to talk a lot about how operations fits in with that. And then if you remember nothing else from this presentation, you can write this down, you can quote me, cash is king. I like profit, but I really like cash. So it's important to understand, just the implications. And we're going to talk about kind of the cash cycle in a health center in a couple of slides. Go ahead, Olivia. Okay, so the three keys that I see to health center profitability are maximizing organizational service capacity. So setting up to be able to do the most service with the resources we have. I'll also say that is very missional for us, right? Being able to serve the community the best I can and to be able to provide access, right? That's one of the things we're all about. So being able to maximize that. So being set up to succeed is great. I think Woody Allen said 90% of life is just showing up. I assume he must have worked at a community health center at some point in his life. So setting up the capacity is great, getting our patients to show up, and now getting our employees to show up and getting our providers to show up, challenge, right? So it's always been a challenge and is maybe a more acute challenge now. And then lastly, getting paid, right? So we've got to set it up. Medicaid obviously is key for us. So really understanding how that works and making sure that our billing is working, our collections are working, we're reconciling that, incredibly important. So while profitability is important, remember, so everyone talks about what is the role of the CFO and so on and so forth. And everyone always has a fancy answer. My rule number one is to make payroll every 2 weeks. That's the first rule. And once you've done that, then, or if you're not doing that, you're going to have big problems that will make your other problems be dwarfed in comparison. So that cash flow and cash levels, in my opinion, are more important than profitability. And we're not going to talk much accounting CEOs, I promise. So we won't talk about cash accounting versus GAAP accounting. All of the CFOs just let out a sigh of disappointment, but there's probably other sessions for that. Gerard next. I'm sorry, Olivia next, apologize. Okay, so to me, I know this is gonna sound strange. I think, maybe in this time it's a little different, but I think that cost control is secondary to revenue generation. The health centers that I see that are successful financially kind of spend where they need to spend. The example I always like to give is I had a client here in Los Angeles, and I was doing a site visit at one of the sites, and I said, what are your barriers to productivity to the staff? And they said, well, gloves. I was like, well, what do you mean gloves? And they said, well, our CFO insists on buying the cheapest gloves we can, so they break all the time. And then we've got to go get a new one, and that slows us down. So that's maybe an extreme example. Really, we look first to see how we can generate and maximize our revenue. Not that cost control isn't important, but it's hard to cut your way to profitability. You hear, sometimes you read the paper, this company cut 10,000 jobs and that's going to improve their bottom line. We need people to generate the revenue. So now that's not necessarily true if you have a high self-pay payer mix. I know there are still a few states that have not yet expanded Medicaid. So maybe that's, a higher payer mix. So if you're doing more visits, yeah, you're generating revenue, but your marginal revenue on those self-pay visits isn't high. And when I say high, I mean over 20%, let's say, these days. If the health center is losing money, needs a quick turnaround, then you got to cut costs. I'm sorry, it's hard to kind of bump up your revenue real quickly. Or lastly, if we're at full physical capacity. So if the clinic is already open on Saturday and nights and, there's still a 6-week wait for a new appointment, it's not, how can we do more? It's, well, how do we add more capacity is the question. Next slide, please. Okay, I think that physics shows us two things that relate very well to community health centers. The first is Newton's first law. A body in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. A body at rest tends to stay at rest, often in physics called momentum and inertia. And I'll translate this to health center talk. A health center that is profitable and growing money, profitable and growing, tends to continue to be profitable and growing unless we have a worldwide pandemic. That's our outside force. So that may have, I will tell you though, just in my experience, a lot of health centers in 2021 and 2020 did better than in 2019 with all the money we got. I'm not sure that that paradigm is sustainable financially. And then a body at rest tends to stay at rest. A health center that hasn't grown in the last 5 years probably isn't going to grow in the next 5 years. So if you're kind of stuck, right, and we've got new people, it's my understanding, that's why you've come to this institute. One of the questions is, how do I break that inertia? How do I move us forward? The second one is the second law of thermodynamics. Unfortunately, I don't know what the first law of thermodynamics is, but it says that the total entropy, which is the physics word for disorder of an isolated system, always increases over time. And so when we have kind of the same management team doing the same things, it gets really stale. All of you know that the healthcare marketplace outside of us is changing tremendously. So we have to change with it. So if you are new to your position and you ask, well, you see something that looks wrong, and you say, well, why do we do it that way? And the answer is, oh, because we've always done it that way. You have my permission to say, that's not a good answer. We got to improve this. We got to make this better. Because if we keep doing business as usual, first of all, if it's wrong, it doesn't make sense to keep doing it as usual. But if we don't advance ourselves, I think we're going to get left behind. Next slide. Okay, so this is what I call the virtuous cycle. I like diagrams. So positive cash flow through, I'm going to say good enough productivity. I'm not going to say a high productivity. I'm going to say good enough productivity and payer mix, right? The reason I obsess over payer mix, you know, your Medicaid rate might be $160. Your collection per self-pay visit might be $16. There's a real big difference in how much money you're going to collect for essentially doing the same thing, right? So that's why I'm always talking about payer mix and always talking about Medicaid. That creates working capital to fund expansion. There is an accounting term that's an accounting term. The way I define it is extra cash to do more stuff, right? So at some point, right, so we got to do payroll, we got to keep a little reserve, but at some point we generate more cash and that allows us to do more stuff. Maybe put in more sites, get more providers, get more patients, produces more revenue, which creates increased coverage of base administrative costs, often also known as economies of scale. So if a health center doubles in size, you don't hire a second CEO, right? So we have a lot of fixed costs. And so as we grow, we have a lot of administrative, a lot of regulatory too. That's the same for every health center. It doesn't matter if you are a $5 million health center or a $100 million health center, you still have to fill out the same UDS, right? So I will say it has been my observation that in community health, bigger is better. I also think if you go look in the private world, that's why private practices are disappearing. There's so much more administration and regulatory compliance. You know, the old paradigm used to be the doctor and his wife was the office manager. I don't mean to be sexist, but I've seen this setup, and that gets like unmanageable at some certain point. That model just doesn't work with all the administrative requirements. So that's why it's important. And it also then allows us to invest in infrastructure to improve quality and efficiency. You know, if we look at our costs, I know we talk about a lot of our costs. The one cost that I guarantee will go up faster than inflation, whatever inflation is your IT costs. There's always some new module you got to buy on your EHR. There's always new things you want to do. And maybe they improve our quality and efficiency, but it's costly. So think about that as an investment. I would say even adding to your referral department, right, of managing referrals and making sure patients show up to the referrals. I would call that an investment in infrastructure to improve quality and efficiency. So all of this patient-centered medical home, population health, whatever, we need money to be able to invest in that because a lot of that stuff, as you know, is not billable. Next slide, please. Okay, then the flip side of that is the vicious cycle. So I used to just say negative cash flow. Now I say break even or negative cash flow through maybe low provider and staff productivity. You could also add, if you're taking notes, understaffed provider or staff, FTEs, under budget. Cyber insurance, gosh, I'll tell you thank you for that comment. The number of health centers that I've heard that have been cyber attacked last year was the most I'd ever heard. So whatever you need to do, this is not an IT session. At the very least, you got to make sure the backup is there. Nothing exposes you more than a cyber attack and say, oh yeah, we back up every day. And then you find out you haven't backed up for 3 months or whatever. Multiple health centers I know have been hit. So don't think, we're not a Target, we're not a hospital, we're not big enough for anyone to notice. You absolutely positively are. So thank you for that comment. When we don't have extra cash, we cannot make those investments in infrastructure to improve quality and efficiency. We don't pay enough or we can't give raises, right? And when I started way back in the day in 1996, maybe that was our model, that we paid less or we didn't give raises. It's just not doable now. Our employees have expenses, and the marketplace for our talent. One thing that health centers are very good at is actually training people. So the marketplace for our talent is rather substantial. That creates a high turnover or high vacancy rate. So that's a huge issue in a lot of health centers right now, that people leave and, it takes a while to replace them, or, we're down 5 providers and, 8 MAs, right? That's a problem, right? And we'll look at how that problem works out financially. That creates lower efficiency and inadequate coverage of fixed costs. So you can kind of see this is a vicious cycle. It's the opposite of the other one. That was a virtuous cycle. Next slide, please. Okay, I threw this in because I do talk about so much about cash. So starting cash, minimum 30 days cash on hand. So basically, what this does, days cash on hand, is your total cash divided by your cash expenses. So you wouldn't include like depreciation or that sort of thing. And instead of expressing it as a percentage, we put expenses divided by 365. So we call it days, right? So, I know that that 30 days cash on hand, right, is 1 month. That's about 1/12. So that means it's about 8%, right? I put a minimum of 30 days. That's an absolute minimum. HRSA wants us to be at 45 to 60 days, just to have that cushion. Someone wrote, I thought that the industry standard was 90 days. Some of the stuff I've seen, I think Capital Link put something out that showed that our average is now around 90 days. This is more a minimum to say when we need in trouble what our minimum needs to be not to get in trouble. If you have in your, let's say, strategic plan to be at 90 days, that's fine. So let's say we start our month with our 30 days cash on hand. So let's say we get a capitation check from our managed care company, if we're in managed care, And then we draw down our 330 grant, right? We often draw down before payroll. So our big expense is payroll. So we make payroll, and then maybe later in the month we get the FQHC wraparound check, and we use that to do our second payroll. This obviously we have other expenses besides just payroll, but it just gives you kind of the sense of cash in, cash out, how things work in the finance department. So we're always bringing cash in. There's probably some regular fee-for-service billings that are coming in, and we're paying vendors regularly. So just give you a little sense of it. Next slide, please. Okay. So I apologize, CEOs, for not including you in this chart, in this table, but I think, kind of the buck stops here. You're in charge of everything. So what I like to do is try to separate the roles and say our chief medical officer or chief clinical officer, maintaining a full complement of providers is incredibly important to profitability, and one that I've seen even before the pandemic, really a differentiator of the health centers doing well financially and those not doing well financially, was the number of provider vacancies. Visits per hour, provider productivity, the endless discussion in our health centers of how many visits per day, per year, per FTE should our providers be doing, something that's often addressed by the CMO or CCO. Setting the schedule. This is not an operational schedule, operational session. We're not going to dig into a lot of detail, but I will tell you your schedule, another great indicator of success. I go to health centers who say, well, we have problems with provider productivity, and they have multiple sites, and each site has their own scheduling template, and people are doing whatever the heck they want. So keeping on top of not every little piece, but just the structure of how we do this is important. And then lastly, pay per performance, right? Setting up an incentive system, and someone said, well, we don't do it. How widespread is it? So it is, I'm going to say, of the health centers that I talk to, maybe 40 to 50% of them have it. Out in the rest of the healthcare marketplace, I think it's like 75, 80%. So if you at least have a reward system to reward your good providers, that's probably enough. I don't know. It's funny when I see, we call it incentive compensation oftentimes, and I'm not sure it incentivizes things. Okay, so someone doesn't like pay for performance on productivity. It's like setting up a mill. Yeah, it's, I will tell you that productivity is always one of the elements of a health center pay per performance system. So I can't read all these comments. So Gerard or Olivia, are you, oh boy. Could you read the comments, please? Read them all at once, and I'll morph them all into one single answer.
Yeah, so I see, do you see unionized CHCs do pay for performance? And in a comment, I dislike pay for performance. It's like setting up a meal. We set targets based on budget and then pay a quarterly incentive for each encounter over the target, working on quality incentives. Are these rewards based on productivity and quality? Do you have some incentive plan models you can share?
Oh boy. Okay. So the union thing, I know of one union, I know of more than one union health center. I am aware of an incentive comp at one of the union health centers, so it's doable, I guess I would say. All of them, yes, all of them have some productivity component, and I would say many of them, productivity is the only piece. Quality is certainly part of some of them, and the one thing you got to do if you're not paneling, right? If providers aren't seeing their own patients regularly, right? If you're not doing a good job of scheduling, and then it's really hard to measure quality, because a lot of time you're seeing someone else's patient or someone else is seeing your patient. So how do we talk about kind of the management of it? The other aspect I would say of kind of the other lever or thing we can change is it team-based? So kind of everyone gets it on the team, and that could be a site or the MAs and the provider. You can define team however you want, or is it just for individual providers? That's another variable I've seen. Oh boy. All right, Gerard, keep going.
All right, we moved the front desk team from operations to finance. Do you see it more often managed through the operations function of finance? I have built models outside of FQHC where percentage is for quality, percentage citizenship, meeting attendance, and volume.
Okay, so I'm going to take the last question first. So yeah, I love a system that says citizenship, like, are you doing the health fairs? Are you doing, it's a little more subjective for management, but absolutely, if we can, maybe we start with just one based on productivity and we add on those other modules that that person suggested. And then moving the front desk under finance. Oh boy. This is where I can't see you face to face, makes it a little harder, but I don't love it. I have to be honest, and I'll tell you why. So the pro of moving it to finance. Now again, if you don't have a good COO and have a great CFO, then maybe it makes sense for you. So I don't want to say it's always wrong, but the argument for moving it under finance is it's the beginning of the revenue cycle. So we'll focus maybe better on getting the correct insurance and capturing the information. And so our billing will be more timely and accurate. So that's the pro for it. The con is kind of all of the customer service. And then when I talk about productivity, the flow of patients, right? Once somebody has waited for an hour, and the provider sat in the back with no one to see, you never get that back, right? You can fix bills later. And I also like to say to CFOs, your life of debits and credits has not adequately prepared you for community health center customer service. And I'll just leave it at that. Sorry. Okay, Gerard, I think there was another comment. Me and my big mouth inviting all these comments, so.
One more, we incentivize whole team support, parentheses, MA and front desk, close parentheses, get incentives based on provider incentives earned.
Yeah, absolutely. I will tell you that, I don't want to say you have to do it, but the folks that do a team-based model really seem to like it. Okay. Now we're going to get to the COO. So it's keeping that patient flow going, right? That's a big driver of productivity. Making sure, so first we talked about the CMO, making sure that we have enough providers. Now we have the COO, making sure we have enough MAs, making sure we have enough front desk clerks, making sure we have enough phlebotomists, whoever else it might be. Making sure that schedule is full, right? That we have enough patients coming in to keep it full. If we can't ask our providers to be productive, if we're not giving them enough patients. Having appropriate facility. It's really hard to be productive in a facility that doesn't make sense. So remember when I talked about we need to build cash to invest in infrastructure. So infrastructure can also be, our traditional definition of it, right? Which is buildings and equipment. So if you need to move to a new, better site, you're going to need cash for that. And that's something maybe a little long-term on the planning. Capturing that appropriate registration information, and then collecting money at the front desk. So the CFO is certainly going to oversee that revenue cycle, right? The billing manager, the collections, all of those sorts of things. Making sure that if in our state we have an opportunity to set rates, to do change in scopes with Medicaid, we do that, and get the best rate that we can. And then on Medicare, just understanding the system and making sure we're getting paid appropriately by Medicare. Grants management. So the good news is we've gotten a lot of additional grant money. I don't know that this is bad news, but the amount of extra work that finance departments have had, especially if you're getting some non-HRSA grants. So we have, provider relief, which is outside of HRSA. And I know people are going with FCC and FEMA. And boy, if you thought the 330 grant was complicated and required a lot of documentation, just try working with those grants. Making sure that we can pay our people enough so they don't quit. That to me feels like number one right now, because it's we'll talk kind of near the end about the employment marketplace, doing the budget, and then that cash and capital planning, right? We have to maybe build a new building or replace expensive equipment or all sorts of something like that. That requires planning. Okay, Gerard, I think there were even more comments.
I think one of the comments was about the percentage of the provider amount in the whole team model. So I think
right. Well, yeah, and that's a variable too, right? How much do the providers get, and how much does everyone else get? I typically see that around 50-50, but keep in mind that there's less providers than other people. So providers are getting more, right? But spread against broader people.
Great, thank you. And then comment, revenue cycle should begin when the patient books the appointment. And then lastly, what about the chief quality officer and the development officer? Where do they fit in this tab?
Oh boy, I thought this was an introductory session, Gerard. I mean, okay. So yes, the revenue cycle does begin then in the ability to capture that information up front. Just because they came in last month and had Medicaid doesn't mean they have Medicaid now. And where do the chief quality officer and chief what? Development
officer, yes.
Okay, so development is a little bit tough. I mean, obviously, development is tough. Development requires investment as well. So the goal of the chief development officer is actually to set up the infrastructure there and then be able to tap into those funds and turn that into a regular revenue source for the health center. The chief quality officer, we are not at the point yet where we get paid much for quality. That was one of the slides I took out, but very little. I know everyone talks about, oh, we're changing our payment from volume to value, has not yet happened. So I suppose there may be some opportunity to earn incremental revenue from good quality scores. I would say a big portion of quality too is not just providing quality service, but getting the data right. And I think everyone benefits when the data is right. So that's how they may fit in. And was there one more comment, Gerard?
All right, two more okay. Comments here I note. One, can you comment on revenue cycle management services being subcontracted? I don't know if we do have a session planned around revenue cycle.
So I'll just say people do it. For some, it works well. For some, it's kind of like a short-term solution that I hate to say this, and don't write this down or say Kurt said, it goes from terrible to okay once you outsource it because these people are professional, and then once we're more stabilized, we say we can do better and we bring it back in-house. That is not an uncommon, but some stay with their vendor for a long time and love them. So nothing wrong with doing that. That's very appropriate. It allows you to buy expertise and buy infrastructure. So certainly an appropriate option for health centers. I'm sorry, Gerard, what was the second question?
No, there's sort of looks like two more comments here. One, we need to ensure we have appropriate PPS rates, but with costs increasing rapidly and the amount of time it takes to process a rate change is so long, what are some strategies for ensuring we have the appropriate cash to sustain these increases in costs during the rate change process that takes 3 years?
Oh, wow. So this is a great question. Boy, we're kind of getting in a little bit into detail. So here's what I would say just broadly. Anytime you can do a qualifying change in scope, pretty much you should do it because as the questioner said, it takes a long time. The process rate setting takes a long time. The other thing I have observed with this pandemic, we think, oh, well, we're understaffed, but the states are moving more slowly than ever in processing our documents. So, you know, kind of start early. And it tends to be, so how do we keep adequate cash? You got to keep the productivity up. It tends to be like when you finally get that change in scope and maybe finally get the cash from it, it's like an injection of energy into the health center. So you've got to manage between that period. You've got to be conservative about budgeting and saying, oh, the state will finally finish it this year and give us our money. Maybe one more question, then we're going to move on from the slide.
Last one here, agree on data. Where do you see data analytics reporting? CMO, COO, or CFO?
Okay, so first of all, I'm glad you said reporting because back in the day, we would make one of those people you named be in charge of data. And so, and I'm glad you also didn't say IT because I differentiate between, you know, information technology, hardware, software, network, and data, right? I think those are two different things. So I don't think the CMO because while there is quality data, so if you can afford it and had a clinical data person and an operational data person, that would be great. But I often see it reporting through the COO, but there's not a hard and fast. Oh boy. So IT probably goes under the COO. I'm going to move on. And maybe we can get all these questions at the end. Boy, people love this slide. All right. And next slide, please, Olivia, I'm begging you. Okay. So our revenue, 50 to 75% from patient service revenue. And note what it says underneath that. The bigger we are, the more of our revenue comes from billing and collecting. I know health centers at 80%. Grants are great, but we tend not to make money from grants. They kind of cover things or maybe let us do new things. For any of you, I guess we have kind of people new to the health center world. The 330 grant, in my opinion, is one of the best grants around because we can kind of, there's a lot of compliance that goes along, but we can spend it on stuff we would have done anyway, right? And once we get the reporting working, we get it working. So it's a really good grant for us. Maybe we have other contracts and 15% is probably high, and then other things, maybe that fundraising that we had. But also I want to disabuse anyone of the notion of, oh, the grant pays for that. I guess the quote should have ended at that, not at his isn't correct. So, so keep in mind, so donations, donations, well, donations, you know, I'd put that part of fundraising, I'd put that in that other. Okay, Gerard, next slide, please. I'm sorry, Olivia, next slide. Okay, so vacancies. So I'm going to go through this quickly. I know this is a little complicated, but basically we have two columns. Current, let's say, or let's say at full staffing rather than current, with provider vacancies. So let's say we're supposed to have 10 provider FTEs. FTE stands for full-time equivalent. Right now, as you all know, it's hard to get doctors to work full-time. A lot of them want to work 3 days a week, 4 days a week. So this isn't bodies or people. This is full-time equivalent. So let's say we're supposed to have 10, however we combine that. And we only have 8. And let's say our average visits per FTE per year is 3,900. So in the first thing, we're doing 39,000 visits. Let's say we collect on average $120 a visit, given all of our payers. So this is not our Medicaid rate or anything like that. 39,000 times 120 is 4.68 million. And let's say we have $1.3 million of grant revenue. So our total revenue is about 6 million. Our provider compensation is 1.75 million. Our other staff, let's say our MAs and our front desk clerks and our billers is about 1.2 million. Our fixed staff is 1.6. So our total compensation is about 4.5 million. Our variable OTPS stands for other than personnel services. And that's about 600,000. Our fixed is 780,000. So the total of that is 1.38 million. Our total expense is 5.93 million. So this health center turns a little profit. Let's show what it looks like then if they lose 2 providers and have those positions vacant. Let's say the productivity is still 3,900. We're only going to do 31,000 visits. We're going to generate less patient service revenue. We'll have less expense. So I've lowered the provider compensation expense. I've lowered the variable staff expense. I've lowered the variable other than personnel services, but we still end up losing money, right? So our providers cover our fixed costs. Next slide, please. Okay. This is what I said about turnover. So let's say it costs us. So the first column wrote NAC. Now NAC didn't do that. I did that. And then someone after I presented one of these sent their own numbers. So let's use the health center's numbers. So they sometimes use recruiting services. So the CEO figured on average, it costs them about $25,000 to recruit a new provider. Their average length of vacancy, I'd use 3.5 months originally. So that's okay. Average productivity at this health center was about 3,500 visits per provider per year. So in those 3.5 months, they lost about 1,000 visits. Their net revenue per visit is $134. So they lost $137,000 in revenue. Their average provider comp, and this was a couple years ago, was $195,000 in fringe. So that would have worked out to $69,686. So they lost $67,000 of that marginal revenue, right? The other thing is it takes time for our providers to ramp up. If there's one thing, here's a New Year's resolution to do everything we can to get better at credentialing. Now, I know credentialing often isn't your fault, but you got to be totally on top of it. You got to be totally in front of it because there's nothing worse than having a provider seeing patients and not being able to bill for it. So this CEO calculated costed every time a provider left, even if they replaced them, that cost the health center $209,000. Next slide, please. Okay, so provider capacity depends on sessions. So I'm going to say something shocking. The more time providers spend seeing patients, the more patients they see. This is why I obsess about the schedule. So we often talk about visits per hour and you got to go faster. How many hours a week do you spend seeing patients? To me, that's a big driver. The other mistake I see providers make, health centers make on an operational basis is they say, well, our target is 20, let's say. And they build their systems to say, when everything works perfectly, we will get to 20, meaning our average is 17. Okay, so we kind of set up the system to fail. It takes time to improve provider productivity. Don't expect to have any magic bullet. And here's the other thing that I have to say for all of you, as someone who's been to a lot of health centers, increases in provider productivity do not correlate with decreases in provider morale. So I have seen very productive providers who are quite happy and satisfied. So this idea of it's impossible and we'll all quit might not hold true. Now, if you say, well, you know, we're all doing 16 a day, the target is 22, the provider stopped listening right there. So it's okay to lower the target. I always hear this fear of, well, you know, Kurt, if we lower it from 22 to 18, then it'll go down to 14. I don't think that's true. I think it's then we have a realistic target that we can actually work towards. Gerard, I think we have accumulated a number of questions. Let's take them.
All right, let's take a look at those here. The questions are around what's the difference between a MD and mid-level in visits?
In productivity, well, if you were to ask the federal government would tell you an MD is supposed to do twice as many visits as a mid-level. That is absolutely positively not true. So probably in about half the health centers I work with, the nurse practitioners, we use PAs some, but mostly we use nurse practitioners, are more productive than the physicians. And again, if the physicians are taking the higher acuity, sicker patients, that kind of makes sense to me, that model. So that model seems to work for the health centers that have it. So I would say, you know, nothing wrong with mid-level productivity being higher than physician productivity.
Right. I think on a couple of slides earlier, there was a note about it was missing insurance contractuals and sliding fee patients, which is a very important value.
Well, yeah, so they're all included in that net revenue per visit. So it's net. So that's after contractuals, that's after an allowance for doubtful accounts. And then it's, you know, a blend, a payer mix adjusted net revenue per visit. So it's in there. I didn't show all the calculations. So fair comment.
Do you use CFTE for some ratios? I'm not sure what.
CFTE, like clinical FTE? I do not. No, I use PFTE, paid FTE, because again, the more time providers spend seeing patients. Now for the CMO, if they're spending 75% of their time doing administrative work and 25% of their time as a provider, yeah, sure, there. But I'm not carving out time for charting. I'm not carving out time for CME because that's what I'm paying for. You know, I'm looking for what I'm paying. So to make it work financially, that's what I need to get.
Yes. What are good provider retention strategies?
Incentive comp. Make sure their MA, if they like them, doesn't quit. They hate MA turnover. Make sure that you know how to schedule so that you're not giving them a new patient with hemoglobin A1C of 10 at 4:15 p.m. So those aren't good retention. Those are kind of don't do the don'ts, right? So those are three things I could say right off the top of my head.
Right. This touches back on the mid-level versus MD question. More specifically, what are some averages for each provider type
The benchmark, I have a slide on that, I promise. I'll also tell all of you, it is my observation, we are moving to a nurse practitioner model. So if I talked about a strategic mega trend, if you look at the UDS, it's got like MD FTEs and NP FTEs, and the ratio has really changed, let's say, over the last 10 years. So we are becoming more and more an NP model.
Are there models?
But we will look at national data from the UDS if we ever get to that slide.
Are there models, examples of high productivity, high provider morale FQHCs out there?
You know what it is? There's kind of like three examples. One where like there's just this culture of productivity, and I'll have to say sometimes quality doesn't get the consideration it should need in those. Then there's a second model where there's just this massive range within the same health center of provider productivity. And then there are ones where there's like everyone is low productivity. So where is everyone happy and everyone productive? Certainly a good CMO, I would say, is one of the characteristics. I wouldn't say above market, but I would say competitive pay and incentive comp is what I see in those things. Now, getting there is the hard part, right? That's just talking about, you know, what they have to maintain it. But all three of those seem to be in place in those situations.
All right, how about telehealth, which is not a function of exam rooms? How about dental providers? And what's the best practice for CMOs, percentage seeing patients and percent administrative?
Okay, so my general rule of thumb is if the health center is over 50,000 visits a year, the provider needs to be at least 0.6 administrative. And you know, if you're doing 100,000 visits a year, it's probably, you know, kind of maybe one session a week to keep some street cred, right? I'm sorry, the second question, Gerard?
The second question was about how about
dentists. So here's dentists. Okay, we'll hold the dentist thing until we look at that chart. What was the third question?
How about telehealth, which is not a function of exam rooms?
Okay, so it is my observation that in 2021, community health center mental health was telehealth. Most health centers did a huge amount of telehealth in that venue. So I don't know about Omicron. I don't know where this is going. To me, let's say that Omicron peaks and then goes away and we're like out of COVID. I think you should still look, because I'm not going to get to this slide. I think you should still look at where is it appropriate, even on the medical side, to have more telehealth. I think the one thing that the pandemic has changed, people want to work at home more, and you've got to accommodate them somehow. I don't know the answer, but you know, a telehealth day for providers, something like that. So these are provider productivity trends from the UDS. You don't have to be an expert in numbers to see that all of them are going down. And I'll say, to me, where that, I guess the family practice is going down more than the nurse practitioner, you know, because they're kind of doing equivalent patient bases. I'm surprised that the nurse practitioner is lower. So just something to think about there. The dental question, dental productivity. Now, dental productivity obviously plummeted in 2020, right? Because you can't really do teledental health or whatever you would call it. So, but overall, dental productivity has held up remarkably well, which is quite interesting. So these are UDS numbers. These are your peers. I didn't show 2020 because it's less. But if you want to benchmark and say, if and when we get back to normal, I don't know that I would say these are necessarily aspirational. And I know of health centers that would go out of business if they'd be at this level. To the person who asked for behavioral health providers, I'll just throw that out while I can. It's like 900 to 1,000 a year. Okay, maybe higher with telehealth, I believe. So that's like an old number. With telehealth, that productivity has for sure gone up because the no-show rate has gone down so much. Okay, next slide, Olivia. Okay, provider consistency. So keeping the same provider, same exam rooms, same support staff. I'll tell you, providers say to me, when my MA leaves, it sets me back 6 months. So I really meant it when I said keeping the MAs. These questions are keeping the same patients, right? So part of our patient-centered medical home, I want to remind everyone, is continuity of care. Continuity of care is also good for provider productivity. Having the same patients that increase the productivity. I would love to say, oh, we got to stop using locums. We're not in a position right now. We've got to fill those slots. So hopefully we can get more providers so we don't have to use locums. And continuity of care, obviously compensating our providers fairly and limiting turnover, huge impact on productivity. Next slide, please. So here's my argument, my financial argument for continuity of care. I know it's better for quality. So if we have any clinicians, I'm not talking, it's just not the subject here. There's something called RVUs, or relative value units, that measure the intensity of services. 99203 is your intermediate office visit for a new patient. 99213 is office visit for an established patient. I think in a community health center, a new patient visit costs like twice as much as an established patient visit. Okay, that's why keeping the same patients. If it's a provider seeing a patient for the first time, so they're not new to the health center, but there's someone else's patient, I'm guessing that is also more costly, is not as efficient. So that continuity of care, we talk all about it in our PCMH. I think it has a big financial impact as well. Next slide. Okay, so why CEOs is the CFO constantly talking about provider productivity? I'll show you. Let's say our net revenue per visit in this case is $120, and our one provider does 100 more visits. That's going to generate $12,000 of additional revenue. With the same people, so it doesn't change our salaries at all. Let's say there's an incentive compensation and 4,000 of that 12,000 gets paid out in incentive comp. We know if it's a medical provider, our medical supply costs about $6 a visit, so that's $600. Maybe office supplies, a variable expense, $3 a visit. Self-pay lab, not on every visit, obviously, but maybe that averages $200 a visit. So from those 100 visits, we get $12,000 of revenue, $5,000 of expense. More than half of it falls to the bottom line, right? Our bottom line is incredibly sensitive to provider productivity. Next slide. So we often talk about how many MAs per provider, and I think that's worth it. But I would argue for all of you, a provider doing 5,000 visits a year needs more MAs than a provider doing 3,000 visits a year. So I would say we also want to look at support staff per visit, visits per support staff, right? Next slide. Okay, good. I wanted to get to this slide because this is about reimbursement. So this is like, I don't even want to say reimbursement 101. This is reimbursement like 01. So community health centers are federally qualified health centers. That is not a HRSA designation. That is a CMS designation. Okay, so by the fact that we are approved by HRSA, we are eligible to become FQHCs. FQHCs are eligible for reimbursement under the prospective payment system, also known as PPS, for both Medicare and Medicaid. And the way that PPS is different from most other systems is we are paid on a per visit rate, not per procedural rate. Okay, very, very visit. Medicaid is a cost-based rate with certain adjustments. You might have done a cost report 20 years ago and your rate gets adjusted every year for that. Your health center staff, your front desk people, who's ever answering the phone, someone said, well, the revenue cycle begins when the appointment's made, must understand Medicaid eligibility rules, right? So I hate that we use the term Medicaid eligibles. It's Medicaid enrollees. I don't care if they're eligible. We're not going to get paid unless they're enrolled. There's something called presumptive eligibility, I suppose. But FQHC Medicare has a standard national rate with some geographic adjustment. It's currently about $170 a visit. We get paid a lot more for new patient visits and preventive visits. So coding, incredibly important. And I believe Medicare lowered for 2022 the telehealth reimbursement from $99 to $97 a visit. I have no idea why. Maybe Nat could tell us. Family planning often, is kind of outside of that and maybe paid on CPT codes. Commercial insurance, you're kind of on your own, right, to negotiate whatever you can with the plan. Oftentimes, they're not willing to negotiate with us. So if anyone on here came from a hospital, at the hospital, commercial was your best payer and Medicaid was worse, you're worse, flip it around in the health center. Now Medicaid is your best and commercial isn't the worst, self-pay is worse, right? But, as far as contracted, self-pay, we have a nominal fee for patients that are below 100% of federal poverty limit. So that could be $0 or it could be like $20. And then a sliding scale for patients between 100 and 200%. And then we're supposed to do full charges above that. Next slide. Okay, getting paid. Good, we like to get paid. Okay, general rule of thumb. What we want to do is the question that your CFO always should be asking themselves is it billable to Medicaid? Right? When we talk about doing something new or something different. So generally our Medicaid billable providers are physicians, doctors of osteopathy, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, clinical nurse midwives, dentists, dental hygienists, psychologists, and LCSWs. The most variation I see from state to state is on the mental health side. So maybe marriage and family therapists, LISWs, ASWs. In your state, there may be a broader range of mental health providers who are also billable to Medicaid. And the good thing about PPS, even for mid-levels or anyone else, we get paid the full rate regardless of who did the service. In some other systems, you get a higher reimbursement if the physician did it than versus if someone else. There might be also multiple other factors to say, is it billable? What's the site of service? Let's go back to HRSA. Is that in your HRSA scope? Licensing, is the facility licensed, is the provider licensed, is the provider credentialed? There are certain services, let's say services done by residents that are billable under a supervising provider. There's some other examples of that as well. Column 2 of Form 5A, where we refer service out and we pay for it. And then telemedicine is something we've all learned about. So is it billable to Medicaid? Next slide, Gerard. Just because Medicaid is billing somebody else is billing, you're billing, and Medicaid is paying doesn't mean that they should be. So you really got to go and look at those rules. It can't be, well, that health center across the street is doing it, so we can do it. That health center may get audited someday. So one of the things you got to ask yourself in any program design, in a new site, is it billable to Medicaid? Or even when opening a new site, how long is it going to take me to get paid for services that new site? Do I have to go through a rate setting process? It takes a while. Other things may have complex rules and low volume. If you're not billing Medicare diabetes self-management training, it's not going to upset me too much. Next slide. Okay, eligibility verification, PCP verification, timely and accurate billing. You have to have a well-functioning revenue cycle. So the CFO can do the payment rates. Everything else in payment maximization relies on other staff, including front desk, including the provider. Next slide. Okay, collecting from patients. I mean, it's not zero, right? So I know it's not your biggest revenue source, but you have to be good at it. Next slide. Okay, budgeting. So for CFOs, don't do the budget alone, get input from others, otherwise you'll have unrealistic numbers. Learn from last year's process, but don't just take last year's budget and trend everything by 3%. I'm sure there are other variables that changed. You can, I've seen it done, increase provider productivity. But if you say, well, we lost money this year, but we're going to make money next year because we're going to increase provider productivity by 10%. You don't want to do that in budgeting, because if you don't get there, then you have the same loss and you've not planned your expenses appropriately. Have goals in our budget. We want to grow. We want to have a certain operating margin, whatever it might be. Next slide. Be also realistic, not just productivity, but, oh, we're going to lower our no-show rate from 30% to 10% next year. Hard to do. Don't base it on grant funding. Oh, we'll break even if we get this grant funding. Stick to your hiring plan. So we often talk in the world of CFOs and finance about internal controls. The weakest internal control that I've seen in health centers that influences the bottom line is we make a budget of who we're going to hire at what salary, and then we hire whoever the heck we want at whatever salary they need to be paid. And maybe you need to do that to bring people in, but then you've got to rebudget. And don't forget there's physical constraints to the facility. Next slide. This is kind of a little bit of inside baseball. I don't think, given all the things, we can skip this one, Olivia. Someone can email. Okay, so let's do this, Gerard, because I know I'm over time. I want to make sure that the mentors have time to talk. So let's let the mentors talk, and then I'll rip through this and the questions, or somehow we'll make it work.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Yeah, man, I feel like we need to bring you back. the kind of questions that folks have had, I mean, clearly shows a strong interest in this topic. So why don't we take some time, as you noted, to have some reflections upon what Kurt has shared with us so far. We've invited Summer Kirby and Craig Glover to do that for us. So we'll turn it over to the two of them to share some perspectives.
Thank you,
Craig, you get to pick if you want to go first.
Summer, you know what? I was raised in the era where ladies go first, so please go ahead.
I kind of guessed you were going to do that in advance, just having been around you for a while. So thanks, Craig.
Sure.
I'll tell you today, as I thought about what all Kurt went through, and great presentation always is. He brings a ton of value and great ideas to the group that we're serving here. And so if you have the chance to influence your state primary care association, if you've got a conference or just information, he's always a great resource to hit on a lot of topics, as you guys are seeing, and willing to answer the barrage of questions. But as I was thinking about a lot of the things that Kurt covered, as well as the questions that have been kind of fired off, I also kind of paused for a minute and gave thought to a lot of the questions that I've seen in Noddlepod from the group. And it just sort of led me to go back and think of what resources that I've used or that I've benefited from in my prior CFO, current CEO role. And some of the things that can be used in terms of like budgeting, and the questions were, how do I get my line staff to understand budget from a financial piece? How do I engage and educate from the level of staff, as well as, maybe at the board level, and what are some good resources that we can use? So I like to use the phrase kind of, if you are a financial person, think about what it's like sitting in those clinical meetings and covering all the clinical quality measures and trying to understand what are each of those, and vice versa. It gets a little challenging. So Jervine Williams, who the groups had the opportunity to meet and hopefully hear some of her presentations as well, has shared resources over time through the various NACS trainings, as well as in Noddlepod, for board dashboards and clinical quality dashboards, and using those as good resources. Internally, we've created gauges, whether it be some of those financial trends that Kurt's talking about, whether it be clinical quality improvement at line level all the way through to our board level, and used arrows up and down, red light, green light, for those that are sitting in the room to try to help gauge them, and small little explanations. If you're looking at financial ratios, okay, days on hand and different things like that, what do those mean? Oh, well, this is how much we have in savings, because we have board members, we have staff members that don't necessarily know some of the detail or understanding behind those financial metrics that we tend to talk about at a higher level. And by doing some of those small things really can help engage and educate your team and get all of your board members to feel engaged and understand, those items too. So I strongly encourage you guys to use Noddlepod, and everyone either start asking, being willing to share resources that you have, because that's one of the huge benefits of this. And I'll kind of pause there because I know we're short on time, and Craig's got great words of wisdom to share, and Kurt will have great follow-up answers.
Thank you, Summer. I'm glad you think I have great words of wisdom. I'll try to live up to your expectation. First of all, I want to say thank you to Kurt for a very informative session. I've been hanging around NAC and the community health centers for more years than I probably want to admit to it at this point, but I've never seen a bad piece of advice from Kurt. So all the things that he pointed out to you are spot on. A couple things that I made a couple notes as he was talking. So the one is, yes, we are all nonprofit organizations, but that is really just a tax status. You need to make a profit, and you need to run your organization and not worry so much about the nonprofit part of it, but really make sure that you're trying to make a profit. As Kurt said, as you're freeing up revenue or income, that's the opportunity to reinvest. So if you're running your business, your organization at break even, or you're losing money every year, then you have no opportunity to grow because you can't reinvest back into the organization. So that's very important. I know we have to, HRSA looks for break-even budgets, but then we have different operational budgets. So keep that in mind. I also like his point that cash is king. Yes, cash is king. The amount of money you have in the bank is a lot more important than what's on your balance sheet, because that's what's in the bank is the real money. So, make sure you go back and look at his 3 points about, maximizing your organization service capacity, filling that capacity, and then making sure that you're getting paid for it. And while we're on that getting paid for it, as the CEO, and then your partner with the CFO, you really need to make sure that you are being reimbursed the maximum amount of your service. Having worked in a couple of different organizations, it's very easy for someone to start doing something. And what started off as, oh, we're going to do this one service and we're going to do it free for this reason. 5 years from now, you're doing 10,000 visits of something that's billable, and nobody's ever thought to seek the reimbursement. So you also, especially for new CEOs and new CFOs, kind of want to dig into your organization and say, hey, so what are you doing? Are we getting reimbursed for that? That's very important to maximize your revenue. Another thing that Kurt touched upon is the marketplace for our staff. And one of the most common things, and I heard it in my own organization right before we went on Christmas break. Well, we're an FQHC, so our salaries are not as high as the hospital or private practice. For those of you who've been around for a while, that may have worked a few years ago. That no longer works today, especially in our climate that we're in, that there are a lot less people in the workforce in the US in general. And then adding on to that, there are less people in the workforce in healthcare. A lot of folks in healthcare, when the pandemic started, said, hey, I didn't sign up for this, and they exited. They took non-clinical positions. So I'm trying to attract staff is difficult. And we can't say, well, you know, if the market in my area is $30 an hour for whatever type of clinician, we're not going to survive if we're only trying to pay people $20 an hour. You're never going to attract anyone. And that goes into a lot of some of the calculations that Kurt touched upon. The last thing that I want to hit upon is the budget. The CFO can't do the budget alone. So CFOs, if you think that you're going to do your next year's budget by yourself in your office, that's not going to work. It takes the CFO, the CEO, the COO, CMO, and a lot of other people to make sure that we get the budget correct. So I would encourage you to start several months in advance and make sure you take into account some of those things you talked about. You can't take last year's budget and increase every line item of expense by 3%. You can't just look at provider productivity and say, oh, well, next year they're going to, see 1,000 more people. You really have to make sure you have realistic targets in your budget. And based on that, I know we're short on time, so I will stop there. And thanks, Gerard and team, for the opportunity to offer some feedback.
Thank you, Summer and Craig. We appreciate you both for sharing your insights with us. So we do have a few minutes more. Kurt, if you're available to stay on a little longer and
sure.
walk
Well,
through the remaining slides.
Yeah, I'm going to work backwards from the questions I haven't answered. So first of all, I'm going to say just one thing, that I believe that the pandemic has permanently changed what minimum wage means. And Costco's paying $16 an hour, guys. So your people know that. They hear it all the time. So I know we talk about providers and other folks, but I really think the expectations of staff, to follow on what Craig said, they're willing to leave healthcare because they actually view that as less stressful. You keep telling them to take care of their mental health. A good solution would be work at Costco with no stress versus at our health center with all stress. So I'm not saying that's not my recommendation. That's what I've heard staff say. Okay. So can I suggest a budgeting tool or app? There's a number out of there. Most health centers do theirs in Excel and it works just fine. But I don't know. I can't recommend a specific one right now. What are the average benchmark goals for setting margins? I would say it depends where you are. I would like to be in a permanent position where I'm at, 2 to 3% every year, Julia. What is the best way to project unduplicated patients, right? Patients, like the UDS number is a tough number because we have a lot of people who come in once, right, and never come again. So I guess what you could do is just assume that ratio holds, and you could develop a visit projection based on number of provider FTEs with vacancies and provider productivity, come up with visits, and then divide that by visits per patient per year. Are you seeing the trend of same-day billing for primary care and behavioral health? That is almost solely dependent upon the state. In some states, they allow it. In some states, they don't. So absolutely. Now, keep in mind, just your warm handoff to your behaviorist already on the primary care team, that is not a second billable visit. So you need to understand what needs to happen to constitute a second billable visit. But yes, Alicia, in the states where it is, where it's allowed, absolutely. Interested in strategies to shift payer mix, currently have large commercial, right? So that's, it depends where you are. So generally what I see is health centers in more rural or ex-urban areas have a higher commercial payer mix because maybe they're the only game in town and everyone kind of has to come to them. Certainly signing up in plans, if you have IPAs, getting assigned lives is one strategy. Certainly doing outreach, is another, being a good enroller, health fairs. Okay, so I think I've covered everything. So warehouses paying $26 an hour. I didn't want to hear that. Okay. Budgeting. Yeah, but okay, so budgeting is a great opportunity to train up the team on finance. So Summer wrote that. Okay, good. Summer, can you confirm a warm handoff to a behavioral health person is not a billable event? So a warm handoff to a billable provider, behavioral health provider may be billable. How are folks using their ARPA? Boy, I'm just going to be honest. Given how long this thing is dragged out, given the problems I've seen in some health centers, it may be time to start thinking about rebudgeting your ARPA. If you were going to buy a lot of extra equipment or, do other stuff, I don't know, maybe you need to redirect that just to keeping your staff and getting your operations going. So that would be my response. Obviously, there's huge variation, but I feel like we're in a much different place than when we started. People in payroll only, yeah, no benefits expense. Yeah, benefits a little tricky. Certainly payroll and people is a great way to spend HRSA funds. Okay, I'm just gonna, these have been great questions. Let's, I think NAC has to wrap up. Gerard, is that? Yes, absolutely.
We're recording this session, Kurt. So if
Okay.
you want to provide a summary that we can leave folks with, we can stick around for that for sure.
Okay, so well, I guess my summary is, the bottom line, a lot of it comes out of operations. The CFO's role in this is to make sure that your Medicaid rate is appropriate, make sure your revenue cycle is working. You'll see in the slides that I wasn't able to get to, there are a lot of threats. I would say right now for me, the biggest threat is staff. It has always been provider staffing and dealing with provider vacancies. But now I think it's moved down further in the organization. So to me, with those H8F ARPA funds or with other funding, to me, the investment right now is in our people and making sure that this thing works. Okay, because if we lose experienced people, training new people, people, and let's say we go back to normal, what I've heard health centers say is, well, we started to pick up, this is before Omicron, and people who were hired during the pandemic said, oh my gosh, I had no idea the pace was so quick. So I think goal number one for CEOs and CFOs right now, keeping people and making sure we can maintain both their employment as well as kind of their quality of life on a go-forward basis.
Thank you very much, Kurt. This has truly been an engaging and informative presentation. It is clear that the cohort got a lot of rest over the holidays, and they came back refreshed and ready to dig in. So that is exciting and encouraging for us as well. Um, I want to just sort of two main things remind folks of. We'll be back together on the 10th of February. Looking forward to presentation by our own Craig Glover, who you just heard from as one of our reactors on leading an effective team. So we'll look forward to that. And then a number of you have asked about our CEFOi wrap-up session and when, if we did identified a new date for that session. That new date is May 10th, 2022. So it will not be on February 18th. Remember, we determined that in Vegas that we changed that date, given that it was the same day that UDS reports were due. We have identified May 10th, 2022 in the DC area, in the DC Metro at the Alexandrian for that. We'll see how hopefully the virus as we're dealing with it now will be behind us to some degree by that time. So mark your calendars. It'll be a full day together, and more details to come. Lastly, we ask that you please take a moment to complete the session evaluation. I think Olivia was plugging that into the chat for you as well, so that you could just click on it there and complete the session evaluation. We look forward to hearing your insights and perspectives and how we can continue to improve on these sessions for you going forward. So thank you again, Kurt, for spending time with us today and leading us in this discussion. We thank you, everyone else, for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you all in February. Take care, everyone.
Feel better, Gerard. Thanks.
Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you.